Hello, I'm the Reverend Dr. Joanne Mercer from the Anglican Parish of Twillingate.
And I'm the Reverend Sandra Fife with St. John's Anglican Church in Wolfville, Nova Scotia.
And welcome to our fourth episode, wow, of our Bible study, Hope is Not Just a Girl's Name, reading 1 Peter in a time of pandemic.
So this is, as Joanne said, our fourth week of the study. So the outline is available for you there. We've been exploring the idea of hope in 1 Peter and in our time, recognizing that this author might have something to say to speak into this time when we're living through a pandemic. This week, we are focusing on how hope reorders our lives.
So, and we look at 1 Peter chapter 4, beginning at verses 1 through 6. One of the things we sort of were concerned a little bit last week that maybe we were too heavy. So we thought we'd start this week talking about sin, because we all know how easy that is. Anyhow, that very first line introduces the notion of sin. We look at these first 6 verses together. We thought of looking at sin, suffering, and a reordering of life.
So one of the things we need to do, though, if we're going to talk about sin, is to start to redefine what we mean when we use that word. One of the people I've read over the years who talks about this is the Episcopal priest, Barbara Brown Taylor, who talks about some of the challenges we have because sometimes we treat sin as something that is a deviation from what is normal. And so we sometimes think of those who commit sins as criminals. So we institutionalize them, we incarcerate them. Sometimes we think about sin as some kind of a mental defect or a mental problem, and so we institutionalize people or treat it as a mental illness. But really, we're talking about understanding sin in a whole different way, because all of that assumes that sin is an action. It's something we do that is somehow wrong. And maybe there is another way to think about sin. Have we piqued your curiosity a little bit here?
So if we were to look at the actual Hebrew and Greek words that are translated in our scripture into English as sin, the word in Hebrew has a notion of a sense of lack, and the word in Greek, a sense of missing. And both myself and Reverend Sandra this week listened to a podcast by Peter Rollins, and I recommend him. He really talked well about this notion and about how important it is for us to shift our understanding of sin away from something that we have some sort of control over, something that we can choose to do or not to do, but rather something that is inherent in our human condition. That when we are born, when we begin to grow, one of the things that we do is we individuate. We create our own identities as individuals, and when we do that, when we become individuals, we are all individuals. A part of that is not being someone else, or not being where you were, or not being not having the gift someone else has, or not. There's a lot of not, like, because I define who I am often by what I lack, and so there's always this sort of sense that I am not completely fulfilled. And so you sort of think about all these self-help books trying to find yourself, right? Because there is within our human nature this sort of sense of that there is something missing, and so we're constantly trying to find that. But he suggests, and I think Scripture suggests as well, is that maybe there is something holy in seeing ourselves with these sort of these spaces of emptiness, these holes within our being. That's not something we have to fill. That is not something that makes us any less of value or worth to God, but is really something that is a part of our nature. And that's sort of how he understands this concept of original sin, that we sort of part of the package of coming as a human being is recognizing this sense of lack, and then searching for what we're going to do. And really, our journey at the end of our faith is not in sort of filling that what's missing, but journeying with that reality. And so if we make that little shift in terms of our understanding of sin, I think that can be very freeing for us and can help us really move into living lives transformed by our faith.
So that makes me think of a couple of things. One is, I think it was Augustine who said there is a God-shaped hole in every person. And so this idea, if it's a God-shaped hole, then it's already filled. So it's not a hole, and it kind of means that in some way we are whole, W-H-O-L-E. So I think there is a lot of play in that idea of the words holy and holy with an H, and holy, H-O-L-E-Y. We could kind of work with those terms and find really interesting things there. So I think that's interesting. And the idea that when we say the 23rd Psalm, one of the newer translations talks about the Lord is my shepherd, therefore shall I lack nothing. And that idea again, that what we identify as lack is something that God is able to fill, or God is somehow able to minister to us in what we lack. So we're going to move a little bit to talk, though, about what we understand now as suffering, now that we've had a little bit of time to think about sin. When we talk about suffering, and we spent a lot of time on that last week, we wanted to be clear that the kind of suffering the author of this epistle or letter is talking about is really, it's not just physical suffering. It's not the kind of suffering that, you fall, you skin your knee, you stub your toe, you break your arm. It's not physical. It's not that kind of physical suffering. There's a connection here in this chapter with the suffering of Christ, and this understanding that Jesus' suffering wasn't just a physical suffering, that his suffering came far before before the night before his death, before he was arrested and tortured and crucified, and before he died. There is a suffering that is inherent, that is part of what it means to take on the pain of the world, and the disorder of the world, and the injustice of the world, and the oppression of the world. So when we stand up for some kind of cause that is right and what we might say just, we will find that there will be suffering, because there will always be pushback. There will always be people for whom this, whatever the current situation is, works very well. So there's not a great desire sometimes to shift structures and ways of being that enable the world to be more equitable, for instance. So we're talking about the kind of suffering that comes from taking on the work of Christ in the world, and knowing that the suffering is not, and sometimes it won't be physical suffering, it will be a very different kind of suffering. So it's not suffering as punishment by anyone specifically, but it's talking about the kind of suffering that really comes from being God's people, trying to fulfill God's purposes for the world.
So in this letter, it's quite clear that the people that Peter is talking to are people who have had some kind of conversion experience, because they have chosen Christ, because they have walked away from sin. They have transformed their lives, and they're making very different choices. They have reordered their lives. So he talks about the kinds of things that the Gentiles like to do, and he lists, drunkenness and carousing and lawlessness and fun things, really. But you sort of think about, when I talked earlier about what sin is, these are often things we do to try to fill our sense of emptiness, or to numb us from our sense of lack, or our sense of something is missing. So they no longer need to choose those things. And because they are choosing to live their lives transformed in solidarity with the suffering of Christ, as Sandy talked about, then that means that the people that were their friends, that were their community, may now malign them. The word in my translation says blaspheme, but I mean, they may malign them. And I think we all know that when we go through something in our lives and we begin to make different choices out of faith, then some people probably make fun of us, or don't understand. So if you sort of start to go back to church, if you haven't been for a while and your friends aren't, they might go like, what are you doing that for? Or if like with the environment movement, I find that like when people choose to grow their own vegetables, or people choose to recycle, or people refuse to use disposable products and stuff, their friends might go like, what are you at? they will, and they may malign you and they may make fun of you. I said to Sandra earlier that sort of, I get a lot of people make fun of me because a part of my learning around the environment and things like that is it had me move now more into a vegan lifestyle, even from vegetarianism. And so, I get a lot of tofu jokes and a lot of things that people will malign me or, will push back, because why would you do that? Or when I bring another petition for people to sign at church, or suggest that, maybe I begin to give people PWRDF gifts for Christmas instead of stuff. And, you start to make choices, you start to live to try to make this reign of Christ, this justice, this transformation of reality, not just for yourself, but for others and for the world. And so when you reorder your life and you live out of that transformation, expect some pushback from the powers, from the structures that be, from people who don't really understand this different worldview, who don't really get why you're doing those things or why you would want to. So to understand suffering in this context, in this letter, as a part of that.
I think too, it's important to understand that some of that pushback, especially the individual pushback that we get from other individuals, can sometimes be because you've made a choice, people assume you're judging their choice. And so your own sense of becoming who you are and making the choices you need to make to feel like you're living a faithful life, our choices are not necessarily going to be the exact same choices. So some people may live out that faith in a very different way than you do. And so there isn't a sense that you've become vegan, everyone has to become vegan, but people can interpret it that way, that if they're going to eat meat, and I'm not vegan, so Joanne knows this when she comes to visit, we find a way to balance all that. But we get exposed to some vegan recipes and share some of that. And then we also eat food that is not vegan, and Joanne helps to cook some of it. So this is not a judgment on people who are not living the same way you are. But I think it often, the pushback comes when people think that because we live this way, we're saying they are less than. These are things we each need to figure out individually. And it's part of that what Joanne talked about in the beginning, that sense of becoming separate from, we're no longer part of our mother's womb, we're becoming an individual. So what are the passions that God has kind of planted deep within us, and what are the things we've become aware of, and where has our conscience been raised so that we want to live in a way that we feel is consistent with our understanding of all of that and our understanding of faith. So it's not as a judgment in a sense, but certainly something that we each need to look at separately, and hopefully collectively too, as we talk to other people and try to understand options. So some of this is really important when we think about what this chapter is saying, because we move through verses 7 to 11, the idea of love and how important it is when we start to think about reframing relationships, reordering relationships through the lens of love. So if we do that out of an understanding of God's love for us and God's call for us to love creation, then to love ourselves, to love one another, then that becomes the motivation for what we do. It's important to remember too that this letter was written at a time when people understood that the world was going to end at any time. They understood this idea that Jesus was coming again soon, the way we hear of in the gospel readings. They thought that was any day now. Jesus will return and the world as we know it will have come to an end. And so there's a sense in which what we do now really matters. Now, we don't understand that in the same way, although I think with the climate crisis, we're starting to become a little more attentive to the choices we make now really do matter. Certainly, I have teenage children who wonder with their friends, Does it make sense in the future to have children? Will there be a world for them? Is there a future here? So we are kind of moving in some way back into that time. But if we're living in a way that helps us to understand that, or we certainly, if we look at Peter's, or the writer of First Peter, their community, if they believed the world was coming to an end soon, or all that they knew was gonna end, what really mattered then? What are the priorities? And so we thought about using this term bucket list, because people use this term when they think about when they know maybe that they don't have a long time to live, or even if they've gone through the experience with somebody else close to them who is dying and who's always wanted to do certain things. And we think of the Children's Wish Foundation helping children realize their dreams when they're living with a chronic illness or fatal illness. What are the things that really matter most to you if your time on earth is limited? And so Peter looks at, how does it mean to live in the world if we understand that world as not being something we can count on forever? What will really matter to us in the end? What are the choices we need to make about how we live with each other, how we live at peace within ourselves, and how we care for God's world?
So very importantly here is the notion of love. And so we read in verses 8 and verse 9, above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaining. So there are a couple of words used here. In verse 8, the constant love, and love covers a multitude of sins. The Greek word is agape or agape, and it has this sort of sense of self-giving love. It's the love that is spoken of, that Jesus speaks of when he commands us to love one another. And so it's a love that is not like a mushy, you make me feel good kind of love, but it's a deliberate choice. And in that kind of love often does require some kind of sacrifice, some sort of self-giving. And I think in our last few weeks in these my groups, we've talked about how some of how we've chosen to live, chosen to stay at home, chosen not to do things to help others is really a kind of love, an act of love. I've sort of posted right at the beginning of this pandemic on my Facebook that I love you enough not to see you. And not to hug you and not to touch you. And so it's that kind of love that it talks about. And that's the kind of love we need to have for one another. But then in verse 9, where it says to be hospitable to one another, that word is also has a sense of love, the philos, that kind of brotherly love, that kind of communal love, the kind of love you have for your buddy, so it's again a very valuable love, but a very kind of active, sort of relational kind of love, reciprocal kind of love. And so that in this transformation, love needs to be our guiding force. The love that Jesus commanded us to have for one another, and the love that comes in community and comes in service to one another. And these loves really shape our sense of transformation and what that looks like.
And so the other thing that's important is to remember in verse 11, whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies. So this idea is that this kind of love that often the scriptures ask of us, or the love they talk about that God has for us, it's not a kind of love that's easy for us to do on our own. So it's important for us to remember that we do the kind of loving that we're called to do is the love that we do with God's strength and not our own. Sometimes it means loving people we don't like. It means working for the good of people who we find difficult to be in relationship with, but we still desire what is best for them. We still can love them in a kind of communal way. We can still do things in a self-sacrificial kind of way because we know that God certainly loves that person in a way that we may not feel able to, but in God's strength we can reflect and mirror that kind of love for one another. So sometimes I think when we get tapped out, when we feel exhausted, we will. I mean, there's no doubt that we have physical limits and we have mental and emotional and spiritual limits. But sometimes I think it's important for us to remember that we need to be connected again to God through prayer and through time in nature, or whatever the things are that are restorative for us. These are the things we need to be mindful of as we think about how we continue to love in God's strength, because the stuff that's being asked of us as people of faith is not within our own power to do. We do it because God can do that and work through us. And that's important to remember.
This really is about strengthening and growing and rejoicing in our relationship with Christ, and that all of these things that we talk about are connected to that.
So one of the things that was really important to me as we were looking at this was recognizing, and something I read over the past week, that this is one of the only times that the word Christian is used in the whole Bible. And I looked it up in my concordance, which is a book like a dictionary, but you look up a word and it tells you where else it appears, where it appears in the Bible. So I have one for the New Testament. Of course, the word Christian wouldn't occur in the Old Testament because it doesn't speak of Christ. But in the New Testament, this is one of 3 places where this word is used. And so that seems significant. The idea that that this name is significant because it indicates that not only are we trying to follow Christ and to live as Christ taught, but we're even taking on his name. And when we think of, that wasn't his name, I mean, his name was Jesus, but the word Christ as anointed one, as one who is appointed by God. So we take on that name. And as we take on the name, we sort of share in Christ's ministry to the world. So we know how important names are. We know how important it is sometimes to name children after somebody in the family who we had a great love for, or whose memory we want to uphold, or who we want something of that person to be reflected in that child's life, whatever it might be. Or maybe it's the heritage of a family, even the fact that we have surnames. I mean, there's something about a name that carries on an identity for us. So the idea that we take on the name of Christ means it's not just a name for us, but something that becomes at the core of who we are and how we live in the world. I think it's funny. I remember one of my children once, when somehow we were talking about this, and I can't remember the context, but talking about being Christians. And one of the children said, "We're not Christians, we're Anglicans." And there was no sense of recognition that you could be Anglican and Christian. And I thought that's really funny. Like, you're maybe school age, you're very young, because they would have been, like whatever, 5 or 6 very young children, whichever one of them it was that said it. But, sometimes as we take the name Anglican far too seriously sometimes. I self-identify so much that we forget that our primary identity as people of faith is as Christians in the world.
And so this taking on the name of Christ, brings with it, the passage suggests, the suffering that comes with the choices, not just with the name, but because you're taking on all that it stands for, and all that Christ stood for in terms of loving one another and transforming our world into a far more just place. And so that this relationship with Jesus, and this relationship with Christ is what reframes everything. And I often used to tell students, I remember, no, I gotta look around, taking a picture to a framer. I don't know if you've ever done that. And so I took a picture to a framer, and I think it might have been one of these, but I'm not sure. You can't see. And so the person put it down, and then they put all different color mats and different little edges, and they put on thing, and they had a mirror on the ceiling, and they put it down, and you would look up to see what these colors would do, right? And it was amazing that when you put a different frame around the picture, completely different colors, the same picture, like different colors would come forward, and in different feelings and different emotions, and you'd understand the picture in a different way. And so I think the same sort of thing when I think about our relationship with Christ. It's like it's putting like a different frame around our lives. Our lives are the same, but we understand it completely different. It reorders what we think is important, what stands out, what goes to the background, what's most important, how we want to be and how we understand ourselves. And so that we live out of that, and that Christ is sin. And so regardless of what the repercussions are of taking on the name of Christ and that identity, regardless of how that might, the kinds of things that might result from that, it's not going to be all good. And I think Sandra talked about that last week. This is not the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel people won't be reading First Peter, I don't think, right? Because there's no sense that if you make that choice, everything's going to be hunky-dory. So because it wasn't for Christ, so why would you expect it to be for you? But rather that, it is amazing, and it's glorious, and it's worth rejoicing in. It's beautiful, it's transformative, it brings out all kinds of new understandings of your life, but it's not necessarily going to be easy.
No, and it helps us to identify within ourselves too the gifts we may have that we don't even really know we have, because we start to see the world and our place in it quite differently. It's interesting. Anyway, the other point that's important to note is that all of this, our understanding of suffering and sin and all of that, is anchored in our understanding of God as a faithful creator. One of the challenges I face pastorally, and I suspect Reverend Joanne does at times as well, is that sense that that so often, even when we think we don't, we default to, if something bad happens, whether you've caused it or whether God made this happen. And so there's this struggle people have within themselves as, what did I do to deserve this? And the idea, why is God punishing me? And I hear these kinds of things literally. I've heard them many times in my ministry. And so and I always try, when it feels appropriate to do so, to help people think about what their understanding of God is, because if our faith is anchored in God as a faithful creator, and as a loving and kind and generous creator, and as one who suffers with us in the way that Christ suffered and was willing to take on suffering for the love of the world, then we understand our own suffering in a different way. So we will not blame God for suffering. We will not think of God as one who causes the suffering, but as one who understands that suffering is part of what it means to live into this new way of being in this reordered world. So God suffers with us as we participate in suffering for the world. So we're not out there ahead doing all this stuff on our own. God is there with us, and I really believe that as we suffer, God shares in that. God mourns with us. God laments with us. I mean, we see all kinds of evidence of that in scriptures in the Old Testament, which people think are full of a wrathful God. No, not entirely. There's a lot in scripture in the Old Testament that speaks of God's loving kindness, God's steadfast love, God's faithfulness. The Psalms are full of an understanding of a God who journeys with God's people and who upholds them. And it's us that need to be reminded of that. And some of the Psalms do that. They start with this, why, O Lord, is this happening? How long, O Lord? But they move to a place of understanding that, I know, God, that you have been faithful. I know you will be faithful again. It is natural to cry out in pain and suffering when that happens to us. But it's also, if we allow ourselves to move through that, hopefully we can reorient ourselves in that understanding of the God who is with us in the suffering, and the God who shares in the suffering, so that we can continue to find strength and hope for the journey. So that's some of where our joy comes from too, in trusting in the steadfast love of God for us and with us, that enables us to continue and to move forward and to have hope.
And really, it is a beautiful image there of this faithful creator, and it's very what you talked about is a very incarnational notion, that that God suffers with, that God loves us so much, that God entered into our lack, entered into our humanity, entered into what it is to suffer and to struggle, so that we know that we are not alone, and that there is really no limit. I love in verse 6, there's an allusion to Christ's descent to the dead, that even those who are dead, even those who you think are lost to God, are not lost to God. I mean, let's think about how limitless this amazing creator is, this love that the creator has for us, and this desire for transformation that the creator has for us. And as much as none of us like suffering, it is a reality of the human condition. And I think C.S. Lewis as well talked about that, that it is that reality, and it is through that we do understand joy, that somehow this rejoicing and the suffering are somehow woven together in ways. And I think we know that we may not like it. I don't really like it. But I have not had this joy, though I've been in the birth room with my niece. So, and I know Sandra has, it's a very painful kind of thing, right? But it's very joyful at the same time. One of the things about Christianity is that it holds these two things together, that you think these things are opposite, but they're not at all. That that you may suffer and rejoice at the same time, that you may be sinful and faithful at the same time, right? And that is part of the mystery of faith, and part of the beauty and the wonder that I think this epistle speaks to, if you're willing to struggle with it.
It was interesting. It's a lovely thought, Joanne. That's great. I was thinking too, as you were talking about that passage 6, I remember when I was in confirmation class and had to learn the Apostles' Creed. It was a memory thing we had to do as part of our preparation. Some of you may have had to do that at various times, and often we'd get little tokens when we remembered something. I still have bookmarks and little lapel pins I got when I was at St. George's Anglican Church and the Round Church in Halifax when I was preparing for confirmation. And I remember asking my Sunday school teachers why Jesus went to hell, because that was part of the creed. And it made no sense to me, because I thought, well, I remember articulating this. I would have been probably 11 or 12, but I understand that Jesus had no sin. So if Jesus had no sin, how could he have gone to hell? And my Sunday school teachers were very loving and kind, but I know that ultimately the answer was, just memorize the creed. That stuck with me. Just memorize the creed. And so often when I do our Holy Saturday services, First Peter is one of the, or first or second, I think it's First Peter, this passage that talks about Jesus proclaiming the gospel to the souls who to the dead. And I remember all of a sudden understanding that Jesus didn't go to hell because of something he did. He entered that, whether we call it hell or that descent is about freeing other people. So it's not about his own sinfulness, but about carrying on the suffering of the world and trying to release people from suffering. So again, that whole idea kind of takes us full circle back to that idea of sin, that isn't always what it's about, but sometimes we need to understand things in a new way. So I've rejoiced in learning something new about that and trying to understand that differently. But it's good to ask those questions, and it's good to continue to seek out answers to those things that don't make a lot of sense, because it's not clear always, and there is a lot of tension in what we understand about our faith. It's not simple. It's not easy to live. But yet we do it, and there are rewards in doing it. We find the joy in the midst of the struggle. So yeah, it's been, and I have to say that since I've been studying First Peter, there's things I didn't know and I'm learning and I'm grateful for, because it wouldn't have been something I would have necessarily chosen as something for a Bible study, but it feels like it's speaking into our time and our circumstances very well. So I'm grateful for the ongoing learning that I'm experiencing, and I hope the rest of you are as well.
So we'll see you soon for some questions that you have. I'm sure you'll have some too. And sometimes even if we don't find answers, finding the right question is a good thing. So I'll see you on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock on Zoom and 3 o'clock on Facebook group.
And I will see my groups on Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Zoom and Thursdays at 11 a.m. on Zoom as well. And links are sent to our parish email list, or if you contact me, I can send you a link as well. Thank you very much.
See you then.
Bye for now.